What's up, Elite Army? This is your kinda well, kinda toxic host, Sarah Rittendale, bringing you another episode of Wellish.
Bethany, welcome back to Wellish. I'm very excited you're here with me again.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yes, I'm excited to talk to you, specifically relationship coach. That's the vibe that we need. I really, like I said, I want to answer the question for people of how you can get a little bit more control in your relationships, how you can prevent feeling that belittled, kind of almost stupid feeling that you feel when you realize that other people have been taking advantage of you or controlling you. But you and I reconnected because I had posted a quote on Wellish's Instagram that I kind of want to read because I feel like it's super, like it was very, when I read it myself, I was like, holy shit. Like I thought of a specific person in my mind when I read the quote and was just like, this is so real. And you reached out and said that you were experiencing similar things. And I actually had several other people reach out to me as well on the quote. So it was kind of like, we've got to talk about this because it's so crazy. But the quote is, when someone says, after all I've done for you, they're revealing that what they did for you was not for you at all, but for their need to control you. Their generosity was a contract with hidden terms. And it blows my mind, that last sentence.
Yeah.
So tell me about you? Like, why did this resonate with you? What was happening that you were like, absolutely, this is real?
It was interesting for me because, like our relationship with one section of our lives really does kind of domino into the others, but I really resonated with it as far as like friendships, how that played out in friendships and in my own origin family, like my family that I came from. Like that really played out. That really resonated with me on those areas.
Yeah, for sure.
I feel like personally, I haven't had a ton of that in relationships. I think because the struggles that I personally had in relationships was a little bit flipped, where I was the one doing a lot of the caretaking. So like there wasn't going to be much for them to say about, but I have experienced it immensely in friendships and family stuff. So that really resonated with me on those levels. But, of course I have like clients and I know lots of people that it does resonate with them in, relationships, intimate relationships too.
But I think I know obviously your work is with romantic relationships, correct? Like do you do all kinds of relationships or is it just romantic?
It usually starts with romantic, but I mean, it really dominoes because so many aspects of people. So it'll stem back to, a lot of our intimate relationships come from our family and those dynamics. And so that, or they'll have a friendship that is interfering with their relationship or, just all of that. And I usually kind of start with the intimate partnerships and that's really my specialty, but it usually affects all the areas of their lives. And I was actually kind of surprised because the reason I did kind of a reel on the boundaries with friends thing that was kind of sparked also from your post was I had gotten an opportunity to be featured in the Sextras publication and they were asking me as a relationship expert of like boundaries with friends. And I was like, that's so interesting because I don't usually get asked that kind of stuff. I usually get asked more of the partnership stuff, but I was like, this is a really interesting opportunity to talk about that too and to share my stuff around it. And it is something that goes, across the board of all kinds of relationships. Like we can be doing really well with our friendships and our intimate partners are struggling or our family dynamic or our work, with bosses or, employees even. Like I've seen that where there's just they don't have good boundaries in their partnerships and then their boundaries with employees are really, weak as well. So it's like, by working with them in one area, they start to kind of improve it in another. So it's weird how it's all connected, I guess.
Yeah, because that's definitely what I think too, is that I agree with you on the relationship aspect of it, that like I was the one giving all of the time and that I experienced this topic of this like generosity turns into a hidden contract with friends and family, that they have these expectations of you and you think because especially family, that F's me up the most because I'm like, aren't you supposed to be doing nice things for me? And it's the whole time whenever it's convenient, you're going to throw that in my face to use against me for whatever reason, for your benefit.
Yes. Yeah.
Can we talk about first what that contract looks like? Like what happens, what that person is doing, what they're trying to do, that whole kind of idea.
Yeah. I mean, I think it really differs by intention. Like, I think people have specific intentions, but I think a lot of it, at least from what I've really seen, has come down, especially with like, friends or family or whatever. It's some sort of validation that they're trying to receive. It's some sort of control they're trying to enact. So you could have the kind of the narcissist piece of it where it's like, they really want to be viewed as that savior. And so to have a savior, there has to be the victim, or there has to be the damsel in distress archetype, or whatever it is. And so they don't ever really want you to get better. They don't ever really want you to go above and beyond, or, they just want that control of the relationship. They want you to act a certain way. They want you to view them a certain way. And they don't want you to maybe disagree or come up against them. They think they're guaranteeing something by that. So I think it kind of can vary depending on if it's, like a personality disorder that's playing out, if it's like a very specific pattern with you specifically, or if it's, just something that they're kind of running over and over. But yeah, I think the ones that I see the most, aside from, but even with narcissists and personality disorders, it is that like that validation, that sense of like, I'm right. And if I'm right, then that means you're wrong. And there's no in between. Because if I'm right, or you've wronged me because you didn't, I've given you this and you're not grateful for that, then now you're in the wrong again. And I have control and I have power and I can tell you to do the things that I want you to do, or be the person that I want you to be. And I think that's where it's really damaging and tough. And I think especially with family, because you are really in that mix. And I talk a lot about with my clients, like even with friends or intimate partners, we're given a choice of their access to us from the get-go, right? But family has immediate access to all of us, and we have to sort of push them out if we want them out. And that's way harder than
for sure
stop someone at the door. Like, these people are already like in your room, in your space, and you're having to be like, I don't want you here. And that's so much harder.
Yeah. I think the big thing too is exactly what you just said, is how the family is there regardless. And I when I first heard that quote, I thought like, oh no, like, have I done that to people? Because when you hear it, it's like, you can think of the situations that you say, after all I've done for you, like, how could you treat me like that? Yeah. But I feel like the really big difference, and is exactly what you were just saying about like narcissism and all of these things, is that when I'm doing it, or a sane person is doing it for somebody else, it's that you are genuinely doing it out of the kindness of your heart, but then they treat you like shit, throw you to the dirt, act like you're worthless. They don't care what you've done for them. And so then you say, after all I've done for you, this is how you're going to treat me. But the reverse is that you're just existing, living life. And they're like, well, do you remember that one time I paid for your groceries? Now you're going to not pay me back in this aspect, or whatever their example is. It's like that they don't do anything because they want you to be happy. They don't do anything because it's genuine kindness, because they genuinely love you. It's because they want something in return. And so I think that that's kind of interesting too. I heard you say at the beginning about how you've done it in relationships, that you're always the one giving, but it's not that you're doing it to be like an asshole, like some of these people are. Or is it to be an asshole? Am I wording that wrong? I feel like
I think subconsciously it kind of is, or that's how it's coming across, right?
Yeah.
And I think some of it too, like I've definitely seen where they think it's assuring them some kind of like continuation of bad behavior, that you're not going to say anything to them about like, they're like, well, I did this thing, so you saying anything, you can't say anything, or, you're going to let me do or say whatever because I've given you this
like
thing.
Blackmail?
Yeah, it's like blackmail. It is. And a lot of the time too, when I look back, like you see it and you're like, that was such a small thing they did. Like, that's something I would do for somebody and I would never think twice about it. Like I've had like the friend group again is really what like comes to the forefront for me, because it's just where I've experienced it the most. But, I had somebody, like I was in a car accident and they came and picked me up, and I had to like, so even when they came to do that, I had to like thank them profusely, buy them coffee, pay for the gas that it took for them to come and get me.
Wow.
And then they like held that over my head. And it was a pretty like intense car accident. And I was like crying and it was just a lot going on. And this person really like was hanging that over my head. And, you know, when I look back at it, I was like, I've gone and gotten several friends from, you know, car accidents, or, you know, I had to take my car to the shop and now I'm, you know, they're keeping it, or, you know, like I would do that and I would never think twice about it. I would never ask them for gas. I would never ask them for coffee, like unless you really needed the gas, I guess. But like I would not.
No, but you would. I know what you mean.
Yeah, exactly. And so I was like, I can't believe I let her hold that on me. Like, you know, that's definitely more of a reflection of that. But, you know, in my mind, I was like, oh, it was such a nice thing to do. Right. That, like, yeah, of course. Like, but then she would use that, and she had used, like, she'd watched my pets when I was on a vacation, and she was like, exhibiting just some really bad behavior towards me afterwards. And I said something to her and she's like, well, I watched your pets. And it was like, so you get to treat me like trash for the rest of our friendship? Like, I'm so lost here. Like, but you get caught up in it in the moment. You're like, oh yeah, well, she did watch my pets. Like, she did pick me up from this car accident, but like, I watch my friends' pets all the time and I would never ask for anything. Like, and then if I was being like, you know, if they felt like I wasn't treating them well, like I would never think of that as like,
you're so quick to automatically assume you're doing something wrong. Like that you're like, oh, well, they did something nice to me. Should I repay that? Do they expect that from me? And it's so funny too. I love that you keep reflecting on the fact that you would never do that, because it's like, whether it's you're thinking about yourself or you're thinking about like quality friends, it's like they don't do that to you, but you don't, I don't know, when you're in that moment, you don't connect that for some reason.
Yeah. Especially because they're playing like a different game than you are. Like, you're not going into it thinking in terms of like a negotiation. You're just thinking like, you know, this is what friends do, or whatever it is. And or partners or whatever it is. And they're coming into it as like a contract or an obligation, or like, how can I use this to control this?
You think that's just like their default mode?
Yeah, I think it can be. I think it definitely can be. Yeah, I don't know. I think it really can just depend on what it is that, you know, they're wanting to get from it, or
and like you said, like whatever trauma or response that they've had in their life, that it's just like they're wanting the validation. They want to know that the relationship is going to continue. They want to feel like you'll owe them or have their back if they need something, without just relying on having a genuine friendship. They feel like they've got to do something in order to make that happen. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think it plays into like, you know, I think a lot of times we really get stuck in the black and white of like, I'm a good person, you're a bad person, or this and that. And I think sometimes people think that they can assure themselves of like, well, I did this thing, so I'm a good person. And it's like, but we're really capable of both, right? Like, nobody really is like all good or all bad. I think we all have that potential.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I think that's part of it too, where it's like with everyone, I think you can kind of start from the get-go of like giving them small responsibilities, or small, if they're asking like, you know, let me get this coffee. Like, you could even do something small and kind of where you don't feel a lot of emotional charge around that, where you're like, if they brought this back up, then I would think it was silly, right? And that would give you an indication kind of who they are and kind of how they use those things. And sometimes it's just like, you know, everyone has their own wounding. So sometimes, or their own preferences, right? So you might have a friend who gets your coffee and then they keep that tally. And the next time they're like, okay, it's your turn. I paid $6.75. So it's your turn to pay $6.75. And you're like, I mean, that's fair. You're just weird, but whatever. Like, you know? But like, they're not trying to use you or anything. They're just kind of have their preferences. But yeah, I think doing kind of those small things, and that's kind of what I tell clients with their intimate partnerships, of that level of trust, like do something small like that and see how they act, and then keep going. Like, because again, that same analogy that we talked about with the family, like if you're meeting someone at your front gate and they're not, and you feel like they're not a good fit, or there's something going on, it's so much easier at that point to just be like, okay, well, I'm going to go and walk back into your house versus like if you've already let them in the front door, now you're having to like get them out, which is so much harder. So if you've already let them do something big for you and now they're throwing that at you, now it's so much more difficult than if it was like a cup of coffee and you see how they respond with that. And also like, again, taking the shame out of it because people are good at this stuff. Like, they can be pretty adept at,
right.
Working these systems because they're usually coming from a wound space. But yeah, I think doing kind of these small things. And then too, like, I actually am a big fan of creating like transactions as far as like if I do have a friend that wants to watch the pets, I actually feel better to pay them. Like I feel better with that. They seem to feel better with that. And it's that transaction. So it never gets brought up again, right? There's no worry of like that it's going to come back around of like, well, you only watch them for like a day or, well, I did watch them. So XYZ. It's like when people do a thing and it's that transaction and it's done, or you just pay a sitter to do it and then it's not going on your friends at all. Mm-hmm. And then, even like close friends, I think sometimes you can kind of gauge like how much am I actually asking them to do? Like, yeah. Because like I had a friend that had asked me once to walk her dog while she was out of town. She was out of town for like a week and her dog goes out like 2 or 3 times a day and she lived like across town. This was when I was living in Austin. And I had to just tell her like, look, like I would love to help you with that. And I could maybe do it like 2 days, but that's actually adding, like, I would have to do that. Like, that's like 30 minutes each way to like go out to do that. And then go to my job that I was working at the time. And like, and I was like, I just genuinely think like I'd feel resentful about that. Like, that just seems like a lot. And she was like, okay, thank you for letting me know that. And so yes. I think I ended up doing it like over a weekend and she had a pet sitter during the week and I just went and stayed at her place with the dog like over the weekend. And I think that is a good gauge too. If you have good friends who can actually tell you like, yes. Yeah, if you don't mind paying me like for gas, like that would be really cool. Or like, no, I'm really sorry. Like I really want to help you, but I can't agree to that. Like that's too
and
much.
Again, that comes back to the trust that like you have to trust that your friend will set the boundary with you, that your friend will be honest with you, that they'll say, no, you know what? I don't think I can do that. And they won't just be people pleasy and agreeable and be like, okay, I'll do that. But then resent you, like you said, for doing that. Such a good point.
Yeah, I think it really just takes getting to know somebody. And then sometimes too, it really does feel good to just have that transaction. And I talk about it with like my business and stuff with people who are kind of starting on that path too, where they're like, well, should I like discount it? Should I offer a discount? Should I do this? And I'm like, if you're going to feel resentful about that, like if you offer this client a discount and they're not showing up on time or they're not doing this, like is that thought going to come into your head of like, well, I gave you a discount. I can't believe you act this way. Like,
yes. Yeah.
And like, if so, then no, don't discount it. And it's like, well, then they might not be able to afford it. I'm like, then they're not able to afford it. Like it's not a fair exchange for anybody. If you feel like you're losing out on something and they feel put upon because of that. So like sometimes it really does, I think, feel good. And even with, partnerships, like you don't have to combine your finances right off the bat. You can continue to do things of like, you could do that same thing of like, if your partner is coming to watch your pet while you're gone and it's making them go way out of their way, you could offer that and be like, hey, do you want me to just like pay for gas or, like get their temperature on it. And if they're like, oh my God, that would be amazing. That actually feels really good for everybody, right? Like you don't have to assume that they are going to just do everything without any boundaries or whatever. And I think that helps, kind of see where resentments could pop up or like, at least you offered, right? Like if you offer it and they're like, no, that's no, this is like part of our partnership. I'm not doing that. Like, then at least you've taken the temperature on that, right?
Right. For sure. It really correlates to the being a good person, that it's like we have this idea that it's good or bad person. And that's 100% how I came into this conversation, that I was like, these are the bad people that have these contracts with you, because the experiences that I've had, that is how I feel about them. But yeah. I can, as we're talking about it, it's like, I mean, I can definitely think of more circumstances. Like if I was constantly like paying for things in my relationship or in my friendships or with family members, and never got that in return, I 100% would feel like, why are you not doing that for me ever? And it doesn't make you a bad person for thinking that, but you consciously say to yourself, if I do this, will I feel resentful? And I think that is a huge thing, because I don't think you think to ask yourself that, because you think, oh, I'm a good person, I'm just going to do this for you. No big deal. It's going to be fine. I'll go ahead and discount the client. I'll go ahead and pay for their coffee. I'll go ahead and do whatever. But then when it comes down to it, it's like, are you going to feel resentful if it continues? Or are you going to be resentful if you do that and whatever, and just in that one instance? I think that's a really cool thing. But people, like, you won't do that unless you're aware to ask yourself.
Yeah. And then I think too, if you do kind of act on that or whatever, I think you have to view it as like that transaction has been completed, right? Like, so my friend who picked me up after the accident, like if she genuinely felt like she was going to feel resentful without me getting her coffee and paying for her gas, like that's kind of whatever, right? But then it was like I did those things and it wasn't over. It was still brought up and used against me. And so I think that also too is part of it, where it's like, you have every reason to ask for what you need, but if you've asked for that, I think you kind of have to view it the same way you would as like a business transaction. Like, this thing happened and you paid me gas and that's what I asked for, and we're done with that. Like, that doesn't need to get brought up over and over or used against somebody or like,
Right.
Like, it never needs to be used against somebody. But the friend piece was probably the last boundary arena that I really had to cross. And I wish now that I could have like gone back. What I would do now and what I have with friends now is like, hopefully I would recognize that patterning before it even got to that level. I wouldn't be asking her to do things, whatever. But I really just wish I'd been more honest in that moment and just really reflected back of like, when she kind of brought the pet things up or whatever. And I think this is something you can do in intimate partnerships, where you can just say like, I offered to pay you for that and you said no. So it's really actually not fair for you to continue to bring this up. Or like, this was something that you agreed to, and it's not a fair exchange for you to agree to it and now ask me to not have a conversation with you about boundaries. Like, that's like, I think it's okay to just call a spade and be like, I appreciated that. I told you I appreciated it. I offered to pay you for it. You declined that. We've moved on. Like, I'm not doing that.
Right. I want to acknowledge too that like 100% that you have to like, but it's almost like you have to have the strength in yourself to do that, because when when you're in that space previously, I can completely picture being like, oh my God, I could never say that to somebody. Like, that sounds terrifying to do that.
Yeah.
But like, so maybe it doesn't sound exactly like that when you start, but that you have that intention, that you think to yourself, like, this is what you have to be able to set the boundary. You have to be able to say, okay, you did that for me, and you can't bring that up. Like how you just said, reminding them that, this was the transaction.
I always like, with my clients, like I think we talked about last time, like I'm an Aries, so my communication is very fiery and very like blunt. Very, like, so I always tell them to temperature gauge it back, where I'm like, okay, this is where I do it. So go back to the level that you're comfortable. So like, if you're saying not fair for you to bring up, like that's plenty, right? You don't have to go full Aries.
Yes.
Like that's fine to just do wherever you're comfortable, but that's the intention, like you said. But yeah, I think it's kind of trying to gauge where people are as far as like, have you seen them do this to someone else? Have you seen them, do you feel like this is the kind of thing they are going to pull back in your face? Have they talked about other friends that way, where they're like, well, I did this for them, and they, because if they're going to do it to them, they're going to do it to you. Like that's just a pattern that they're enacting. So I think just, trying to gauge that. But if they have, offered it for free, I think it's the same messaging of like, okay, well, if you don't like to do that, I won't ask you to do it again. But that still, again, is not, depending on what they're kind of using it as. For me, it was a lot of the time for me to not say something about a bad behavior, or for me to do something I didn't really want to do. Like, I don't really want to, do this thing for you, but it's like, well, I watched your pets. Okay. Or like they were, having some really intense breakdown. And I was like, I just can't, I don't have capacity for this. And it's like, well, I watched your pets. It's like, okay, but that doesn't mean we don't have any more boundaries moving forward for all eternity. Like, I don't know. Like, and not to be too fine a point on it, but I have like the easiest pets to take care of ever. I don't feel like it's a fair transaction at all. Like my dog sleeps like 10 hours a day.
But so you're like, really, what did you do?
Yeah, like what did you do? You took her out like twice a day, like whatever. But yeah, like I think you just have to keep holding that and then just making that mental note. Like the first time they do it, let that kind of be the last time they do it, like that's kind of the mental thing I take from that. If it gets thrown back at me, I'm like, well, that's the last time I'm letting them do that because, or even if you talk it out, like if it gets offered again, like if, it didn't happen because I didn't allow her to watch my pets anymore after that. But, for that friend, for example, if she had said like, oh, you're going out of town, I don't mind watching them, I would remind like the current Bethany would remind her of like, okay, well, the last time you did that, it seemed like you really weren't comfortable doing that. Like it because it got brought up and I don't want to put you in a bad situation. So like, I'm actually going to get a pet sitter this time or like, like reflecting because that's valid, right? Like that's how they're telling you that they felt about it. So it's like, I'm not gonna, put you in this situation that clearly made you uncomfortable and affected our friendship. So no, thank you. Like, thank you for offering. Noted. You offer. Like, and I think too, with friends and partners, like it might just be something you recognize about them that it's just their work that they need to do. Cause it could just be, it doesn't mean they're a bad person. It could just mean like, it's possible that this friend had been taken advantage of a lot before. And so that was her way of trying to like hold a boundary of like, who knows? Like, I don't know what her situation was, but like, it doesn't mean she's a bad person or even a bad friend all the way around. So I think it's okay to recognize that just might be an aspect of that friendship you can't access. Like you're just not going to ask them for favors. Like you're fine going to dinner, going to coffee, but everybody pays for themselves and you're not going to ask them to watch your pets because that just doesn't seem to be like an area that they can really like feel comfortable in.
Yeah. We talked about this a couple times and I like that you keep kind of talking about it in this sense is that I feel typically the answer is cut them off. Like they shouldn't be your friend anymore. But I feel like that's not always the case, like especially when it comes to family. It's harder to do that. I get obviously, you can choose to phase family out and all of these things, but it is hard. So what advice do you have for keeping that person at bay? Like so that they don't do that to you. You feel like you have a little bit more control over your relationship with them.
Yeah, I think with friends, it's easier. With family, like I've had to estrange from pretty much every member of my family, like one by one, because of these behaviors. So I'm actually really good at giving that advice because I've had to do it like 5 different times. But yeah, like I think it really, it's almost like a pattern or like a science that I have it down to now where you're just like, you just have, it depends on what it is that they're doing, right? But I think really reflecting back to them is like just the biggest thing, right? So like, I'm not like actually a huge fan of unnecessary conflict. Like I don't mind conflict, but I don't love creating it where it doesn't need to be. So with a friend, I think it's fine to just kind of like, if that was their reaction to like the pet sitting, for example, to just never ask them again. And they might never bring it up again. And you've just kind of moved past that. And then again, if they do bring it up, then you're just reflecting back to them like, well, like the last time this happened, you said that it made you, it seemed like it made you uncomfortable. So like, I don't want to put you in that situation, whatever. Or, if it is getting to that point where you really have to kind of distance yourself and cut them off, then I think just having as clear of a conversation as you can about that of like, this behavior is affecting me really negatively and I can't allow that. You're making your decisions. I'm going to go ahead and make my decisions. And I think it's better if we just kind of go our separate ways or whatever.
So you actually have that conversation with them?
Yeah, I have had that conversation with
That's
people.
Cool.
I've had it with family. I've had it with friends where I had it with, like a mentor I had, like I've had to have, it's like some sort of karma I'm enacting in this lifetime where like maybe I never like walked away from people in a past lifetime. I've had to like have these difficult conversations, but like, I think that's probably also very helpful with what I do because then I can help my clients like navigate them as well.
It's probably also why you're an Aries.
It's also why I'm an Aries, because I don't know if I would have had the strength to do it without that. Like,
yeah, right.
Oh my God. They're not, but it doesn't get easier. Like, they're never easy conversations.
Okay, that's a good point.
Yeah. Like, even like as many of us, and family is definitely hard, but, like I still get nervous about having those conversations too. I still get like shaky about like, oh, I really don't want to have this conversation.
Yeah.
But yeah. And that's kind of my go-to, I guess, is just that like strength stance of like, this is the behavior. And I'm very clear of like, not like you are a bad person or X, Y, or Z. It's like, I'm very clear about what the pattern or the behavior is.
Mm-hmm.
And I try in my heart to have a lot of love and compassion for it, because we all have patterns. We all have wounds. We all have these things.
Mm-hmm.
Just very clearly, like, this is the thing that is, creating a lot of, space between us and negativity, or is affecting me in a very, if I can give them examples, sometimes the examples aren't needed, but if you can give them examples of like, you throwing these things back in my face makes me very uncomfortable, and it makes me feel very backed into a corner. And I just can't allow that in my friendships. I can't allow that in my life. Like, it's just not something I'm comfortable with. So like, I think it's probably just better, since we can't seem to work this out, for us to go our separate ways for a while, and maybe we can reconnect in a few months or whatever. But, and only saying that if you mean it, but like, yeah, I think just being as like clear about what the behavior is, why or how it affects you. And then my favorite phrase is like, I can't allow that. I'm not allowing that. And just like, because there's really not anything they can argue with that. Like, what do you say to someone saying like, I'm not allowing that in my life, I can't have that? It's very like, it's a personal decision. It's saying like, this is my decision. It's not saying anything about you. It's just saying, this is where I am with it. And I think people it seems to kind of de-escalate a little bit, where, if I'm just like, I can't allow that, they're like, oh, okay. It's like, I don't know, I always get good responses from it, so I use it. It sounds kind of harsh, but I guess like, there's not anything emotional for them to grab onto. I think that's the point.
Right.
Like, you're kind of going into like, you did this and you're so terrible and it made me this and it's awful. And I just can't have someone like you in my life. Like, that's mean and emotional, and you're going to get a big response, not taking emotions out of it, but kind of channeling them into like, you want to be very clear of like how it's affecting you. And that is an emotional thing, So like, I think saying like, it made me feel like I can't trust you. It makes me feel like I can't be myself. It makes me feel uncomfortable. It makes me feel like X, Y, or Z. But then ending it with that strong, unemotional stance of like, this is the decision. And people really seem to like, they just don't know what to do with that, I guess, other than just be like, oh, okay. Like, like what else can you do?
Yeah.
And it might, fight with you a little bit about whatever it is, which is why I kind of like to have just these strong examples. And again, not like piling on, but just saying like, this is actually kind of the third time we've had this situation. You brought up the car, you brought up the pets, you brought up, I don't know, whatever, didn't buy me dinner. And this is the way it made me feel. So then you've got kind of these examples, because if you're just making a broad statement, like you throw things in my face a lot, they're like, well, what do you mean? So I think going in with just kind of that like really strong examples of how that made you feel also, and then making kind of your decision. And you don't always have to even go into those conversations with the decision in mind. You can kind of see how they respond. Like you can say like, hey, I've noticed this has happened 3 times. What do you think about that? Like, what are your thoughts on that? Like, see, like, if they're like, oh my God, I didn't even notice I was doing that. I could see how that would make you uncomfortable. Like, I'm so sorry. Like, let's, work on that versus, being like, I don't do that. Okay, well, let's give you like 3 examples.
So obviously, yeah, you do.
Yeah.
Now you're gonna try to gaslight me.
Yeah. Yeah. But again, I know it sounds like almost like preparing for a court case or being a district attorney, but like
I feel like it has to be like that kind of.
It almost does, because think of like the alternative. Like think of like every conversation you've had where like, I mean, if I were to say to you like, wow, you're always late, you'd be like, when am I late? And if I was like, okay, well, last week, this week, whatever, then you're like, like I was late. Like, that might actually be something. But if you're just giving someone an accusation, which is like what you see a lot in intimate partnerships, where they're like lodging these things at each other, like, well, you're lazy, you're this, you're negative, you're that. And I'm like, don't give
these
them
generalizing, talking about their character.
because you're not
sort
going
of thing.
anywhere. You're just going to make them immediately defensive. Whereas like if you're saying like, okay, I've noticed that there is this pattern and here are some examples of that pattern and here's how that pattern made me feel. I mean, that's really clear. Like there's nothing really, that they can say about that. I mean, these are the things that people will actually like really understand versus like, well, you're always late. Well, when am I late? Well, last week. Well, that's just one time. Like this, you see how like that can spiral. But if you come in prepared,
and I don't think there's anything wrong with like taking a note on your phone. Like when you start to notice it, like I do have notes in my phone of like every time. I had one for my boyfriend the other week because he was saying that he never interrupts me. And I was like, you probably interrupt me hourly, like guarantee it. He was like, no, absolutely not. And I kept a note on my phone of the times and the conversation we were talking about in that moment. Like having the examples. So because I knew that when I just say it, he's like, no, I don't. What are you talking about?
But
then when I come to him with the list, I come to him with the list and he's like, oh, I guess I do that. And it's like, yes, like what you can't say anything to it. My therapist said something to me about that one time, asking them a question that will like throw them off their game that they're not expecting that what are they supposed to say to that? Like saying something along the lines of like, if somebody says something to you, like calls you out about like, being a certain way and they're like, oh, that's weird. What would make you say something like that about me? And then the person's like, and doesn't have a good answer, which is what I like about your like solid, like, I can't allow this. This is why, and this is my decision. It's an awesome formula for creating the boundary that yes, it's strong. And yes, like you say, it sounds like, a district attorney or but it's because it stops people in their tracks. Like they're like, nope, sorry, can't budge anymore. You can't come up with other things.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think especially like, in like the work I do with the astrology and the spiritual community, you hear a lot of like advice that's very like, well, just like, hear them and connect and just let it flow and let this go and don't say this and like just whatever creates the peace. And it's like, but sometimes that does create the peace by like some of this hard work or some of these kind of boundaries or whatever. Like we know boundaries are healthy for relationships, and sometimes these boundaries take that hard work. And like, I think sometimes people are really more appreciative than you think, like, especially people who are kind of wanting to grow and develop and are always wanting to improve themselves. They want that feedback. They want to know like, hey, you said you were going to call and you didn't. And then I just waited. And like, I would want to know that where I would, so I could apologize, so I could like change the behavior, whatever it is. And I think that's, people can kind of hear this type of advice where it's like, kind of district attorney or like, it's definitely not what you generally hear in the spiritual community in some of the spiritual community, I guess, of just like that, like easy, let it come, let it go. It's like you have a lot of control over your relationships and you really can create change in them. But sometimes it takes doing some things a little bit differently or having kind of these tough conversations. And again, like, of course, like with my communication style being what it is, people can take what I say and level it back to where they're comfortable. And that's the point, right? So, if they don't want to feel like they're going in like a district attorney, you can phrase it differently, or you can like, you don't have to pull out your phone if you don't want to, like you don't have to do any of that. But giving examples is really going to get you where you want to go. Like I'm just saving you from spiraling down. We just gave like 2 or 3 examples of if I said this is what they're going to say. That's the natural response they're going to have because it's what everybody would have. Like we don't like being accused of things. We don't like being told that we're this negative thing. And immediately we're going to say, no, I'm not. Or what do you mean? Or like, when did I do that? Like, these are the very natural responses you're going to have. So if you go into the conversation without any of that prepared, like I could pretty much tell you what your conversation is going to be, and you're going to cycle back to this and you're not going to have resolved anything. And you're actually maybe have made it worse because now you feel like you can't ever bring it up again versus like going in there a little bit district attorney, like taken care
Yes, just having be prepared. Yeah.
Yeah, then you're gonna get where, like, if you say like, hey, I've noticed this pattern of being late. Well, when am I late? Okay, well, here are the 3 times, and this is how it made me feel. And it's like, oh, okay. Now what do we do about that? Like, that's getting you where you want to go versus like looping through emotion or spirituality in that false sense where you're just like, well, whatever keeps the peace, like shove down everything else. It's like, no, you got to get in there. Sometimes you got to like grab things by the root and,
I love
take
that.
charge and be in control of your relationship to some extent. Obviously not, fully, but if there's something happening in your relationship you don't like, you have to take charge of that. You have to own that and be like, this is a problem. Like, I really wish it wasn't, but here we are,
Yes. I love that because I've definitely felt the same way, being a type of person that likes that kind of stuff too, is that it's just like, you just have to let it go with the flow, let everything like play out how it plays out. But then at the same time, we'll be like, why are my relationships like this? I don't understand. And like wanting that control so bad, but not realizing how much control you genuinely do have in your relationships. But you just have to find the words, find the ability to state what you want in your relationships. But I think a good point too is saying like, hey, this is what you've been doing. This is what I've noticed. This is how it makes me feel. So that when they say, okay, what are we going to do about this? The person says, oh, I'll be more mindful. I'll try to be better about it, whatever. And then it keeps happening. Then when you do approach the conversation of, I can't allow this in my life, again, what are they going to say to you? Because it's that you've tried, you made an effort, but you can't go any farther because you're not allowing that in your life.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I think then people are kind of in the loop. Like nobody's surprised, nobody's caught off guard, nobody's blindsided. I think, that really is kind of the way to keep the peace, actually, is to like keep everyone, informed. And I say it all the time, like in relationships, clarity is kindness. Avoidance is actually being very cruel. And, I was saying this to a client even just yesterday, because it's another thing I hear a lot where people are like, well, like this is kind of okay, or it's not that big of a deal, and it's like, okay, but if it's problematic, it's a problem. That's like, you have to kind of allow that to be the reality. Like if you are continuing to circle back to it with them, or like it's continuing to be an issue, like if it's come up in your mind like 2 or 3 times and it's something you've had to address, like it's problematic. Therefore, it is a problem. If it wasn't, it wouldn't even be in your consciousness, right? Like if somebody doesn't have like a problem with alcohol, it wouldn't even be on your mind. If they weren't, if texting their ex wasn't an issue, you wouldn't even be thinking about it. Like it wouldn't be in your reality. So like it is a problem because it's presenting itself as a problem.
Right. Absolutely. So just to recap, so essentially, so people will do this because they want something, whether that's validation, they want some kind of reassurance that they are good enough, whatever their reasoning is, they're doing it because they want something from that. So you're figuring out kind of what they want. And then you talked about starting small, trying to figure out who you can trust by doing tiny things to see how they react, testing the waters, see how they respond. And then when they respond poorly, pointing that out and saying to them like, hey, I've noticed X, Y, and Z example. It's made me uncomfortable. Like, what are we going to do to fix it? And then if you continue, do you continue to kind of like do those experiments almost again with them?
I think you can like kind of go across the board though. Like, I think if you notice that pattern with like, like the coffee example, if they, if they buy your coffee and then a couple days later, they're like, well, I bought your coffee, so you need to do X, Y, and Z. I think you're just like, oh, this is a thing, what I mean? So like, I think you got your answer from something like that.
Yeah, that's very true. That you don't have to keep testing it. You have to keep trying.
Right. It's just like, and it doesn't have to be like, I feel like, I don't want it to come across like you're being sneaky and you're just like,
sure, okay.
This. But like, you're just kind of exploring each other and seeing where your preferences are and whatever, and just seeing like personality types or things like that. It's the same as like, you're just kind of noticing, you're getting to know someone, you're noticing things about them. And, if you feel like they don't handle their finances well, then that's just information that you're like, okay, well, I'm not going to give you my bank card then. Like, I'm not going to give you my credit card. I'm not going to take a credit card out in your name. Like, you're just kind of taking this all in as information of like, okay, like, how much can I trust this person? How much can I let them in? And in what aspects?
It's not being sneaky, it's being strategic. It's making sure that you are taking care of yourself, that you feel good in your relationships. And it kind of, I don't know, just like you say, like you just being able to problem solve and figure it out together. And that's where the communication comes in and making sure that you can do that. And then if it's a person that, is super toxic and you can't communicate with them, then obviously that's grounds for dumping them. But if they're a normal person, that they're a kind, good person that just doesn't realize maybe they have these habits, then being able to talk it through with them. And that's an okay thing to do, a good thing to do.
A good thing.
Take care of
you're
yourself.
Not exploding. Because that's like another piece of that is like your truth doesn't go away. So if you're just shoving it down, then it's like the fourth time they're late. Now you're exploding at them for all the other times they've been late or whatever. And it's like, if you'd addressed it before it got there, that was my big thing. I would just let things go. And then I would just like explode. And they're like, where is this coming from? And it's like the past 6 months. Like,
yes.
That's not fair to them though. And like, but that was my pattern because like that people pleasing or that like, lack of boundaries but like your truth does not go away. If they're causing a problem, like you need to address it much sooner rather than later. So you're not exploding at them.
Yes, for sure. I think it does help too, like keeping that actual physical list with your own like viewpoint on it, because it can feel like it's happening so much more than it actually might be. Like I have another list in my phone from first people. There's a couple people in my life that are like family and they always are crossing boundaries. And so I started keeping a list of ways that they cross boundaries. I haven't written in it in a little while. And it's just like, interesting that I have this constant feeling of they are the type of person that crosses a boundary. But I realize that if I don't physically have something to write down, it's kind of like maybe it's not that it's in my head, but that it's consuming my mind. I'm allowing it to consume my mind more than I really should.
No, I think it's great that we're, talking about that, because I think especially with like, relationship problems or friendship problems, especially with like, female friendships, I feel like it's just like not talked about enough. And I feel like people feel really, like you said, like kind of silly or like they've been taken advantage of, or they don't want to share that stuff. Or it's like, I don't want to like people to think I'm a loser. Like, I don't know, like it's like, I think it's good to like have these conversations and get these topics out there so that people can actually find solutions. Here, they're not alone. There's no shame in it. Like all of our relationships have different dynamics, and there are areas of relationships that maybe we shine and other areas we need to work on. And, that's just very normal. Like everybody's got these things they have to learn.
Yeah. And they won't know to work on them unless you're willing to communicate that to them. And that's how you control your relationships, by making sure that you're communicating and being honest.
Yeah, definitely.
Love it. Well, that's great. I appreciate you being here. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.